and welcome to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Aarons, and today we'll be continuing the discussion I started last season on trills. This time I'm going to focus on short trills. There's a tremendous amount of literature available in which musicologists and performers have discussed how to play trills from the perspective of translating the symbols used by Bach and his contemporaries in their manuscripts. If you're not already familiar with the systems used, then I recommend studying further. What I'm going to talk about on this episode is less about how to play the trills and more about why we play them in the first place. So, let us begin by looking at one of the most heavily ornamented pieces I've ever come across. The F major suite, the second of Handel's Great Eight of 1720, opens with an Adagio movement in which nearly every right-hand note is ornamented in some way. Here it is in full. Unlike long trills, short trills serve a primarily vertical function, used to beautify or draw attention to a particular note or harmony, with the situation being one of stopping and enjoying the moment, rather than encouraging the harmony and counterpoint to develop through time. The two basic ornaments, the trill and the mordent, form the core around which alterations can be made in order to create a diverse array of ornamentation. We'll start with the trill first. Standard Baroque trills, with a few minor exceptions, always start from the note directly above the primary. You'll find them most often in cadences, and their length will vary from short to long depending on the circumstance. Consider these two from the end of the piece. The first one is long and drawn out, and the second is reasonably short. Starting on the upper note is a convenient addition in cadential situations, because you are forced into creating an artificial harmonic circumstance which strengthens the cadence. Instead of having a simple 5-to-1 situation, you have an appoggiatura on the 5, creating more pull and sonic importance on the 5 chord. In the Handel, at the very end, this is exaggerated like everything else in the piece. He gives us the natural chord progression, and with the addition of the trill starting on the upper note, we have a double emphasis. Starting on the upper note is considered a given, and this is nowhere better expressed than in the opening phrase. If played as written without ornamentation at all, it sounds like this. Handel first starts with a mordent, then he adds a turn, and then a trill, with a small tail at the end. Now, if the trill did not start on the upper note, but started on the primary, we'd get a repeated note, which sounds a little less elegant in the situation. Instead, it's like this. Another way of saying this is that Handel constructed the phrase assuming that the trill would start on the upper note. Before I go any further, I'd like to clarify something which students and colleagues have consulted me about in the realm of trills. Trills and mordents, if written as symbols, are never restricted in terms of how many repetitions of the trill are to be made. If a composer wishes to restrict or guide the repetitions and the rhythmic values of these ornaments, they will do so by writing them out in full, as notation rather than as a symbol. In order to make the decision of how long to play a trill, we have to first understand the function of the trill. Is it to be used as an accent, like most mordents are used? Is it to be used as a note extension, like most trills are used? Is it cadential, where trills may start slow and gain in speed to the end? To know the function is to understand what is required of the trill. Once we understand this, then we can experiment to find the most effective way of accomplishing it. Mordents, unlike trills, always start on the primary note. These are used to accent the primary note, and in this capacity, the majority of them will be played as 3-note offerings rather than extended note lengthenings. The case in bar 8 shows us 2 mordents beside each other on the same note, and I choose to play the first one as a short mordent to accent the note, and the second one I choose to play as a longer mordent to extend the note to the next part of the phrase. Sometimes, due to the positioning of the note in the phrase, we may be asked to play a mordent in a less accented way. At the end of the first long phrase, where the intro is repeated in C major instead, Handel puts a mordent on the first note of the bar, which happens to be the end of the first phrase and the beginning of the second simultaneously. If we played the mordent to function as an accent, the end of the cadence would not sound relaxed. If, however, we extended the mordent and started it a little slower, then we'd get the end of the phrase feeling while still having a mordent with less accent. The use and execution of ornamentation is fluid. It changes depending on the situation, and indeed may even change during performance. The area that gives students perhaps the most trouble involves adding ornamentation where none previously existed. This is a challenging subject to talk about, and is fraught with conflicting opinions by all who practice it. I'd like to start by talking about the easiest additions we can make in terms of ornamentation. The most basic strategy in adding ornamentation is one that follows a pre-established pattern. If a composer writes an ornament in a musical phrase, you can usually be safe adding it in a similar phrase that appears later on in the piece. In the Courante from the A major suite, Handel starts like this. When he starts the second section, it is written without the ornaments. So, we can imitate the opening by adding the same mordents in the same places. Similarly, if there is imitation in a different voice, you can add ornamentation in the same spot. The opening of the Gigue from the same suite has mordents in the right hand, but when the left hand comes in with the same figure, there are none. So, add them in if you like. Even if the music is not directly imitative, you can still add in ornaments if the rhythmic pattern or gesture is similar. It's more complex, but it's easier than it sounds. In Bach's C-sharp minor Prelude and Fugue from Book 1, there is a passage in the prelude in which he writes a mordent on successive long notes in the bass. He does this the first two times, and given that the gesture of a leap to the long note is the same, there's an opening to do it the third time, even though it's not written. Here's how the whole phrase sounds with both hands and the new ornament in the bass. Now, the right hand also has long notes that are approached by a leap, similar to the bass, but there are no mordents written for them at all. In my view, there's no reason why we can't start adding mordents here as well, similar to what we're doing in the bass. The two outside voices would therefore sound like this. Lastly, the inside voice tends to play long notes at the same time as the low voice. So why not add a matching mordent for the last time this happens? Now, all together we have something like this. What we're essentially doing at this first stage is taking what the composer has given us previously and applying it to similar musical circumstances, both in terms of gestural content as well as structural. It is the most basic and reliable way of adding ornaments, and it's, for the most part, foolproof. However, for the audience member who is familiar with the piece you are playing, these additions will sound rather predictable and studious, and if performed without conviction, they will sound as if you're simply following instructions from your teacher. To add ornaments on your own requires more distance from the subject matter at hand, and definitely some courage in terms of doing something unpredictable, not for the sake of being original, but to point out to the audience in an auditory way something special about a phrase or musical situation which may not normally be heard. Complex additions of ornaments is a subject unto itself, and I will cover it in another episode. So, until then, keep practicing, and try looking for patterns in the ornamentation used by the composer you're playing. This will give you clues about what ornament to add and when. Bye for now.